Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. I don't normally do breaking stories, but last Tuesday I did a kind of a breaking news event on the SIG P320 and the military equivalent M17 and 18, following the death of an airman at the F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming from an apparent uncommanded discharge of an M18 military pistol. I told you then that I had been working on this for really several weeks. I didn't want to talk about the 320 until I had a lot more information and had kind of settled within myself what I wanted to say. So I'm ready to do that now. If you're interested in guns at all, you've undoubtedly heard of the SIG P320 pistol controversy. A number of uncommanded discharges have been experienced by many military and police shooters, as well as some civilians. Several police agencies, several training facilities have now banned the use of the P320. Now, SIG insists that the 320s are perfectly safe, and they attribute the problems over their comments in the last few months. They blame it on holsters, they blame it on weapon lights, they blame it on ill-trained users. They blame it on everything except the pistol. And it's becoming more and more obvious that that is simply gaslighting by SIG Sauer. In one statement they released, they even claimed that the problems, the allegations being made against the P320 being unsafe is just a ploy by the anti-gunners, and that they would eventually expand this to all other brands of pistols as well, which, again, is not true. Recent developments in the last few weeks include a release of a report by the FBI Firearms Research Unit of a Michigan State Police pistol that was involved in an uncommanded discharge. It's interesting that when the FBI did their research, the holster maker, Alien, sent someone to have a look at the holster and confer with the FBI. SIG chose not to participate in their investigation. That's telling as well. But the most recent that I mentioned a few nights ago is the tragic July 20, 2025 death of a U.S. Air Force Security Forces desk sergeant at F.E. Warren Air Force Base just outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming. He was killed when his SIG M18 pistol, still in its holster, discharged into his chest while it was sitting on a table being touched by no one. There are unconfirmed reports that there are a couple of other lawsuits about civilians who have been killed by the M18, but to my knowledge, this is the first fatality we know of by a pistol in the 320 series. Almost immediately thereafter, the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command, this is the missile folks, paused the use of the M18 sidearm in that command. This is not an Air Force-wide suspension of the use of the pistol. However, we have evidence to suggest that the U.S. Air Force European Command is said to be considering a similar pause in the use of the M18 sidearm. I want to read for you a statement that SIG finally released related to this incident. It is very differently worded than most of SIG's releases about the 320 or M17 and M18. This is very well written. It is exactly what it should say. It is exactly what the kind of attitude that SIG should have been professing all along, in my opinion. Our hearts are with the service members and families impacted by the recent reported event at the F.E. Warren Air Force Base. We proactively offered assistance to the U.S. military as they investigate the incident and remain willing to help in furtherance of their ongoing inquiry. We have absolute confidence in the military's ability to conduct a thorough investigation and are working with the Air Force and Army to answer any of their questions. As I said, that kind of attitude and that kind of verbiage several months ago might have headed off the problems that SIG is experiencing now with this pistol. So stick around. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on the P320, M17, M18 uncommanded discharges controversy. And I'm going to talk about the SIG Sauer company and their CEO in general terms. Those of you who watch my videos regularly realize that sometimes my take on an issue is just a little different than the other theories that are out there. And I'm going to point out some things that I have not seen on any other YouTube channels, that I have not seen other commentators bring up. But I think they point very clearly to what's going on here. So stick around, we'll be right back, and we're going to spend time talking about the SIG P320. Let's start with a little history of SIG Sauer, and perhaps even more importantly, their current CEO, Ron Cohen. The modern SIG Sauer company started with the merger of the Swiss company SIG and the German company Sauer and Son in 1975, and the first weapon they brought out in 1975 was the P220. After several reorganizations and ownership changes, it is currently operating in both Germany and the United States. The U.S. operation is headed by Ron Cohen, a former Israeli Defense Forces soldier who was formerly the CEO of Kimber, producer of rifles and pistols. And I think Cohen's time at Kimber is important enough that we need to spend a few minutes on it. The original Kimber company made semi-custom, super accurate rifles. It was owned by an Australian family by the name of Warney, and they produced these rifles once they moved from Australia and went into the gun business here. They produced them in Oregon. The Warney family is still in the gun industry, producer of Warney rings and mounts and accessories along that line. Kimber was bought out and moved to New York in 1991. The company in New York used for the production of Kimbers was Jericho Precision, who was headed by Ron Cohen. So he became the CEO of this new Kimber company. Kimber branched out past their rifles and expanded the line into 1911 pistols, which had a pretty good reputation to begin with. But Cohen decided to move those 1911 Kimbers out into what I would call mass market type production. And a lot of the internal parts were converted to MIM parts. Look up MIM. It's a complex subject. I had to learn a lot about it. Originally, MIM parts for guns were considered to be very substandard. And I think early on they were. They were weak. They were not dimensionally perfect. But the MIM process has been improved to the point that they are now becoming widely accepted in the gun industry. MIM parts, rather than being machined or cast, they're made from a kind of an atomized powdered metal mixed with a waxy material, and I'm told it's kind of like toothpaste when it's ready to go. It gets pressure injected into molds, then that wax component is kind of melted out, either chemically or by heat. And then those parts are sintered at up to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which kind of makes it into a solid metal product. They can be extremely accurate to tolerances, although when they get heated and sintered, they shrink. So that has to be factored in. So setting up the molds, developing this process to be done with really strong, really accurate parts is very expensive. But once the MIM process is standardized, these parts are pennies on the dollar compared to what CNC machined parts would be for a weapon. And the way I understand it, the important thing about MIM is they can make these very precise parts a lot smaller parts than can be done with machining, because in machining the part has to be held into a fixture so that it can't move. And so big parts, machining is great. Small parts, machining is a problem. And MIM solves that problem. Mike Wood, the revolver guy, did a 3-part series of articles. And Mike is a very knowledgeable guy in the industry. He worked with Smith & Wesson, who explained this process to him. Most of the hammers and triggers in Smith & Wesson revolvers now are MIM parts. And they are convinced that they are not only better parts than the way they used to make them, but they are made at a fraction of the price. They said $1,000 to $1,100 to $1,200 Smith & Wesson revolver might have to sell for as much as $2,000 nowadays if it were still made with the labor-intensive process they used 30, 40 years ago. So MIM parts can be excellent. They can also be sloppy, depending on who makes them, and depending on the quality control standards the company requires. By switching to MIM parts in those Kimber pistols, the prices could be brought down lower, and Kimber started selling a lot of 1911s. Now, I'm not saying that Kimber pistols are bad. I have a Kimber Micro 9 in my pocket right now. I carry it almost every day, and I am perfectly happy with the quality and reliability of that little pistol. But with their full-size 1911 pistols, a lot of custom gunsmiths would not build up custom weapons on a Kimber weapon. And I spoke with Richard Heine, who I consider to be the best custom 1911 builder alive. He said he got to the point that he was satisfied with the slides and frames of Kimbers, but if someone wanted a custom pistol built, the first thing he would do is throw away every internal part it had and just use the slide and frames, because the quality of their MIM parts would not allow him to build a pistol to the standards he held. There are a lot of Kimbers out there. There are a lot of them being sold, but I've had a lot of friends who had 1911 Kimbers who had to be sent back to the factory multiple times before they became reliable and functional pistols. So, in my opinion, the way Cohen changed the production of Kimber 1911s, he damaged their reputation pretty significantly. But he made a lot of money. And that got him a job as the CEO at SIG Sauer. According to Cohen, in an interview I saw, he said when he took over SIG in 2004, SIG was close to going out of business. Those of you that know SIG, you know that they're metal-framed, double-action, single-action style pistols, the 220, 226, 228, 229. They were highly thought of. They were widely used by a lot of federal law enforcement agencies. Navy SEALs carried SIGs. They had a really good reputation. In fact, the reputation, in my opinion, probably exceeded their actual quality level. People who love SIGs describe them as the Swiss watch of pistols. But those metal-framed SIGs had frame cracking problems and other issues. I'm not putting them down. They were accurate, they were reliable, and they served a lot of fighting men and women in law enforcement and the military very well for a lot of years. But in my opinion, that double-action, single-action trigger design was always difficult to train with. That change between the first trigger pull and the second trigger pull was a hurdle to get over. Every agency that carried those pistols had training issues. But we saw that double-action, single-action pistol design start to really fall off pretty rapidly, mostly because the Glock came on the market. And it had not only a consistent trigger pull every time, but a much lighter, shorter trigger pull than you had to have with those double-action only variations of the older existing designs. Glock very quickly took over the law enforcement market. At one point, it's estimated that 60 to 70% of American law enforcement officers had a Glock in their holster. Now, in 1999, I was working at the Illinois State Police, and one of my first assignments when I went to the academy, and I was a civilian, not a trooper, so I did both training and research. My first major project was to test new pistols to replace the Smith & Wesson double-action, single-action 9mm pistols. This was in '99. The Illinois State Police adopted the Smith & Wesson Model 39 in 1967, the first major agency in the country to go to a semi-auto pistol. And they had gone through 2 or 3 different generations of those pistols as time went on, but the pistols were wearing out. They were using extremely hot plus P plus ammunition, and they thought it was time to look at something different. So we tested 8 different pistols, 7 actually. We tested 2 variations of the Glock with both the 5.5 pound trigger and the 8 pound New York trigger, and then 7 other pistols, which included a SIG. I think I designed one of the most fair testing protocols out there, and a couple people in the industry told me that. That's why I say it was a fair test. A lot of those tests, when a major agency would set up a testing protocol to look at pistols, but by the time you read the first page of their report, you already knew what was going to win. Because if they liked SIGs, SIGs were going to win. If they liked Glocks, Glocks were going to win. If they liked Smith & Wessons, Smith & Wessons were going to win. I did not set up the program that way. I went in with no preconceived notions. And actually the top shooting pistol score-wise of those that we tested was the H&K USP. Now we were testing 40 caliber because we were going to, at the same time that we switched pistols, we were going to switch from 9mm to 40 based on the way we thought ISP shootings went, involving a lot of automobile metal and glass, and they needed more bullet to do more penetration. I've talked about that before. We had 3 complete cycles running 32 shooters through each cycle of the test. And they were high average shooters, they were low average shooters. We made sure there was a female on every team of 4. And we did not use range officers. So we did not use what you would call highly skilled shooters. We used rank and file cops in the Illinois State Police. And when I got all done and we're running the numbers, it's like, gee, the lowest scoring pistol consistently is the SIG. Highest scoring consistently was the HK, and there wasn't a huge difference between top and bottom. But before I published this, I called around to some people I knew, like Clint Smith at Thunder Ranch and a friend at Gunsight, and a couple of other state police agencies I knew that used SIG pistols, and I said, hey, what do you get score-wise? And they all kind of chuckled, and they go, oh, SIGs always produce the lowest scores. They're reliable, they're accurate, people like them, they shoot them fairly well, but they're a little difficult to shoot. And the consensus between all of us, we thought the problem was the bore height of those SIG pistols, those metal-framed SIGs. The bore axis was quite a bit higher above the web of your hand than other pistols like a Glock. So the recoil impulse was not as much straight back, there was muzzle flip involved. And that was our theory. I don't know if it was true or not. But there was not enough of a scoring problem to not pick the SIG. It's just that all things factored in, which included both the performance, the malfunctions, and the preference of the shooters, we ended up with Glocks. The SIG did not win. Well, SIG realized the Glock dominance in this market, and they knew they had to come up with a polymer-framed pistol to compete with the Glock. So they did that, and their first polymer-framed pistol was the P320. This was a hammer-fired, double-action-only design, and it was the first to use what they call a fire control unit, which is a metal unit that slides into the polymer frame. That is actually the pistol and has the serial number on it, but it allows you to get different designs, different sizes, different shapes of polymer frames that this FCU, this fire control unit, will fit into. The 250 did not do well. So the 250 was changed to a striker-fired design. So now we have a striker-fired polymer frame pistol to compete directly with the Glock. The Army was looking to potentially replace the M9 Beretta pistols that they had. And Glock, Beretta had an upgrade pistol, FN, and the SIG 320 were all entered into these tests. Now, I was not up to speed on a lot of these tests, but in 2017, I was at the SHOT Show, and SIG announced that, wow, we just got the military contract. SIG will produce 2 pistols for the United States military, 2 sizes of the 320 to be known as an M18 for a more compact pistol and the M17 as a full-size pistol. And the SHOT Show, quite frankly, was in absolute shock. Everybody assumed that was up to speed on this process, everybody assumed Glock was going to get the contract, because everything they'd heard was Glock was head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of performance and in terms of what the test soldiers liked. Now, I'm from Illinois, and corruption in government in Illinois is embedded into the system and has been for a couple of centuries almost. So everybody at the SHOT Show was, I wonder who got paid off to change this specification to guarantee that SIG was going to get the contract. That was the thought process, right or wrong, definitely not proven. Since then, the military has taken delivery of approximately 500,000 M18 and M17 pistols. Many, many more thousands have been sold to other militaries around the world, as well as a lot of law enforcement agencies in the United States and others. Part of the process was undoubtedly low price. And these companies will very often bid very low prices to large police agencies and militaries, to the point that they might not even be making any money, because they know for every one they sell to those high-profile agencies, they're going to sell dozens to civilians. So it's almost a loss leader for them to lowball these bids to the military and law enforcement agencies to get those civilian sales. And it has paid off handsomely for SIG with the P320. SIG's response to these uncommanded discharges by the 320 have been, frankly, unbelievable, unprecedented in the U.S. gun industry. To this point, it's been total denial. They will not admit in any way that the pistol could be the problem. What they've essentially said to both the military, law enforcement, and the civilians who own these pistols is a giant middle finger. I have never seen an American gun producer respond the way they have to the kind of overwhelming evidence that's starting to pile up about these uncommanded discharges. There are more than 100 reported uncommanded discharges, resulting in allegedly 80 injuries and at least one fatality, and one commentator on YouTube reported a couple of other possible fatalities. The latest, as I mentioned, is the Air Force fatality. Now, one of my sources has given me a little bit more details about what might have happened with that sergeant at F.E. Warren Air Force Base. Now, I want to stress that this is absolutely unconfirmed. This is third party. It would make sense of what happened, but it will be a long time before we know whether or not this is certain. Allegedly, the sergeant removed the holster from his duty rig with the clips on the Safariland rig, placed the pistol in the holster on a table. He then removed his body armor, went to the bathroom, returned to the area of the table, still touched by no one, and at that point, the pistol discharged into his chest. Several commentators have said, what kind of a person would lay down a pistol in a holster pointing to himself? This makes more sense than someone who would do such a dangerous thing as to put any pistol down pointing at themselves. And again, this is absolutely unconfirmed. This is just one speculation of what might have occurred that day. I also want to point out on that short video I did on Tuesday night, the first description that I read was not from the Air Force. That was a posting on social media that kind of outlined what happened. The only thing official from the Air Force was the memo on Air Force letterhead. Now, SIG has beaten back many, but not all of the lawsuits resulting from these uncommanded discharges. There have been a couple of heavy settlements awarded to the victims. But of course, those cases are on appeal. The evidence that the SIG P320 is suffering these uncommanded discharge, it's just too large to dismiss at this point. There are too many videos showing these pistols going off in holsters when they are not being subjected to any possibility of something getting into the holster or getting into that trigger. SIG's response, though, is really what blows me away. And it kind of, to me, it proves the problem. If SIG knew how to fix these uncommanded discharges with the P320, they would do it. They would fix it. And they would come clean with what's been going on. So I think this tells us they don't know how to fix it. So, in my opinion, what's the problem with the 320? It's twofold. It's a bad design with a fully cocked striker system, and it is quality control of a lot of those MIM parts that are in that fire control unit. The 320 striker system is pre-cocked with enough latent energy to fire a cartridge. Other polymer frame striker pistols don't have that much energy preloaded into their striker system. Pulling the trigger moves that striker back, builds up the kind of spring pressure necessary to fire a primer. The 320 system has a safety in it to prevent the firing unless the trigger is physically pulled to the rear. So that if for some reason the sear were to release, the safety mechanism is supposed to catch that striker and stop it from firing. But apparently, poor quality MIM parts within this system are compromising that safety. Now, as I mentioned, MIM parts can be excellent. They can also be rather poor quality. But they save a lot of money. Is that money that's being saved worth the level of problem that SIG has got now? I think that's a very valid question. The FBI report of the Michigan State Police pistol. And this pistol was sent to the FBI as it was the moment after it fired. Empty case in the chamber, full magazine, still in the holster, had not been removed from the holster. In that report, I've seen something that no one else has brought to light. It said that many of the pistols that MSP, Michigan State Police, received from SIG had what they called dead triggers. Now, they don't elaborate, they don't define what they mean by dead triggers, but I think it's safe to assume that these pistols wouldn't go bang. In the FBI report, it said that SIG Sauer determined that these dead triggers were caused by out-of-specification parts, that they ground off 20 thousandths from the trigger to bring them into specifications and then refitted them into the pistols. 20,000, that's a half a millimeter. So that tells me we're looking at MIM parts that need some finish machining to get to the operable condition they need to be in. These weren't in that condition. They weren't finished, and they weren't quality checked. So in other words, Michigan State Police received pistols that wouldn't go bang because the triggers were not properly manufactured. Now, this points to not only bad parts, but it means there was a total lack of test firing of these pistols before they were shipped to the Michigan State Police. This is on page 5 of the FBI report, which you can get online. Now, I can tell you from working with other gun companies in test protocols and things that I've done over the years, a lot of modern manufacturers, including Smith & Wesson and including Ruger that I know of, they don't actually test fire every pistol they ship. Smith & Wesson told me one time that they do completely test fire every one of their weapons that is being shipped to a law enforcement agency or on a military contract. But they don't test fire pistols going out to civilians simply because it costs too much money to buy the ammo. They say it's cheaper if a pistol has a problem to be shipped back to them, repaired, and returned to the owner than it is to test fire them at the factory. Saving money. Doesn't make sense to me. Makes sense to them. So it's not just SIG that isn't test firing every weapon that leaves their factory. But to not test weapons that are going into the hand of law enforcement officers or the military, is unthinkable. This is on page 5 of that FBI report. There is a part within the Michigan State Police pistol that was sent to the FBI. There's a part in there called the striker pin hook. The striker pin hook in that pistol that failed at the Michigan State Police had a ledge on it, and I will show you pictures here from that report. It looks like a manufacturing artifact. It should be two flat surfaces bearing against each other. That's how sears work and release. But this one part had a ledge, kind of an edge down on the surface. And the report said that ledge reduced the engagement surface between the primary sear notch and the striker pin face. Page 17 of the report. That pistol that failed for Michigan State Police also had substantial play between the slide and frame. They could move it side to side. They could move it up and down at both the front and rear of the slide. That slide and frame was manipulated to simulate the motion of a pistol within a holster during physical police activities. In other words, if police are going to carry this in a pistol, there's chances they're going to run, jump, get in a fight, roll around on the ground. So they manipulated that slide and then manually released the sear without the trigger being pulled. I'll show you pictures of this. Of the 50 attempts of this manipulation test by the FBI research facility, the pistol fired 9 times. There's a photo there showing the muzzle blast of that primed case. In another 6 instances, the primer was struck by the striker, but the dents were too shallow to set off the primer, so too weak of an impact to set it off. This is on page 29 of the report. So apparently day-to-day activity by a police officer or a military personnel carrying that pistol in a holster is enough to move those internal parts to the point that if that sear releases, possibly because of a ledge artifact on badly made parts, the safety system will not catch the striker and it can fire uncommanded. So in other words, in this FBI manipulation test, the striker's safety failed to catch the striker 30% of the time. Now that pistol had over 1,200 rounds through it. That officer had gone through the transition training. Michigan State Police also sent the FBI research facility a brand new pistol. So thinking that the wear might be part of the problem, they took the new pistol, they subjected it to the same manipulation in the holster test, and it failed on the second attempt. This is pages 29 and 30 of the report. So it's not caused by wear within the system. Even a new pistol did the same thing. Let's go back to that Army bid where SIG got the first award for the M17, M18 pistols. Now, I ran a pistol test for a major agency, the Illinois State Police. I know firsthand the kind of political pressure that can come to bear during that test. In our preliminary finding, before anyone knew who we were going to choose, a trooper made a phone call to a holster company. They were not authorized to do that. They called a holster company and said, gee, if we're going to get, for example, Glocks, how long would it take you to supply 2,400 holsters? The next day, we got a call from Smith & Wesson. They flew a vice president out to meet with me, and he offered me free handguns if we would back off of Glock and go with them. I know what takes part in these things, and I know that corruption and offers of jobs, money, and everything else can be made. Many of these tests are predetermined before the testing ever begins. They know what they want, and they know how they're going to rig the test to get it. So was the Army M17, M18 testing rigged to guarantee that SIG was the only company that could win? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a question that someone should be asking. Since then, SIG got the bid for the M7 rifle, the M250 machine gun. to create this 6.8 by 51 common cartridge with a multi-part case that's supposed to operate at 80,000 psi. Reports are they're down below 70,000 psi because they're having problems maintaining that pressure safely in that multi-part case. Some of the soldiers who have received these new M7 rifles are not happy with them at all. Yet SIG got the bids. Who do they know? How? I know this is getting to be a long video, but I want to be detailed, and I want to tell you how the industry normally operates. After the Illinois State Police had had Glock 22 pistols and 23 pistols for about 8 or 9 years, weapon-mounted lights started to become common. We had 3 full-time SWAT teams in the state, North, Central, and South. And they started using weapon-mounted lights. I believe they were using Surefires. They claimed they were starting to get a lot of malfunctions in pistols that had been just spectacularly reliable. We contacted Glock. Glock said, well, if you use our lights, we don't seem to think there's a problem. They're made primarily of plastic. They're very light. But if you use metal-based lights, they're heavier. They can cause the frame to flex. They didn't deny anything, but they tried to explain it. But here's what Glock said. Get the pistols that are most commonly malfunctioning, and we will fly some people in, and we'll look at them. So we did. I was not running the firearms training program at the state police at that time. I had moved on to a different job at the main academy. But they sent me back down there as kind of a technical advisor to watch this process. What we found were, with the SWAT team, they were separate from the firearms training unit. They conducted their own maintenance. They supplied their own ammunition. Well, what we found out was these SWAT guys were a little bit too lazy to keep their pistols clean. These things were gunky as they could be. They also had not gone through the annual check. Every state police pistol that is assigned to the firearms training unit gets torn down by an armorer, checked annually. Any broken parts are replaced, cleaned, lubed, put back into service for that officer. The SWAT teams weren't doing that. So we found broken locking block pins, which were very common. It caused no problems for the pistol. A lot of times you didn't even realize they were broken until you removed them. So they functioned perfectly. There were some parts in the extractor system that would occasionally have some problems. So the pistols that were most prone to malfunction with these lights, I told the range staff, I said, you got to clean them, you got to detail strip them, you got to replace any bad parts, and we got to have that done by, this was on a Friday, we got to have that done by Tuesday because Glock is flying in 3 people. They flew in an engineer from Austria, and they flew in 2 from the Smyrna, Georgia plant. It took a while after the pistols had been cleaned, lubed, to get them to start malfunctioning, but they did. And by the afternoon, we had identified 2 of these pistols with mounted lights that were malfunctioning significantly. Glock took those pistols when they left. 2 days later, we had replacement pistols shipped in. And a couple of weeks later, they called us and they said, we have identified the problem through super high-speed photography. The frame is flexing due to that extra weight out on the accessory rail. What they told us was the 4 points where the slide rides on the frame of a Glock, we're going to space those out a little bit further. We've already done prototypes. When we do that, that flexing problem seems to go away and the reliability comes back. We will replace your 2400 pistols with the new design. Now, people talk about generations in the Glock pistol, Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5. Within those generations, Glock has many minor changes along the way. They constantly will look at those pistols and constantly debug them. Here's the deal. These pistols were 8 or 9 years old. The SWAT pistols had had thousands and thousands of rounds through them. The ordinary troopers had had a few thousand rounds through them. So they're well worn. Glock said, here's the deal. Your night sights are going dim. Police price for a set of night sights is $65. If you will give us $65 per pistol, we'll take your old ones and we'll give you 2,400 new ones. Now, if you want a lesson in customer service, there's the lesson. The thing is, in my experience of 40 years dealing with the gun industry in the United States, that's how most manufacturers treat things. Ruger has had problems. They bend over backwards to fix problems for people. Smith & Wesson has had, everybody has problems, but Smith & Wesson has bent over backwards to make those agencies happy with their M&P pistols. That's the kind of customer support that is normal in the United States gun industry. We've seen none of that, absolutely zero, from SIG related to this P320 problem. Ron Cohen, the CEO of Kimber, started using cheap internal parts to make money, to save money and up the profit of Kimber. It worked so well, it got him a job at SIG. He's done the same thing there. Every dollar they can save. One source said that the kind of MIM parts being used in the SIG P320 save about $30 per unit. And in all fairness, at the price they're charged in the military, that may be all the profit they make. So if a company's going to make profit, and they are entitled to make profit, they've got to streamline their cost as much as they can. But when you streamline to the point of reliability where these things could go off and hurt or kill people, that's completely irresponsible. Here's something else about Ron Cohen. At one point, the police in the country of Colombia wanted to buy a significant quantity of pistols from SIG. U.S. production was tied up making M17s and 18s for the U.S. military, so they could not produce the number of pistols necessary in the amount of time when Colombia wanted these pistols. So they made them in the German plant. Now, Germany has export restrictions. There are some countries which German-made weapons cannot be exported to. Colombia is one of those countries. So Cohen arranged for the end-user certificate, the international statement of where these arms are going. Instead of saying they were going to Colombia, because that would be illegal for guns made in Germany, he said they were going to the U.S. And once they arrived here, then he turned around and shipped them to Colombia. Germany found out about this, and when Cohen arrived on a flight to Germany sometime later for some kind of business meeting, when he stepped off the plane, the German police arrested him, cuffed him, took him to jail, and he sat in jail for several days. When this problem, this illegality in Germany was resolved, Ron Cohen eventually pled guilty and received a suspended 15-year prison sentence and a fine of $675,000. That's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of mentality who is running SIG today. And that fits exactly with the kind of response we've seen and heard from SIG about these uncommanded discharges. SIG is based in New Hampshire. Recently, they convinced the New Hampshire legislature to pass a law severely restricting people's ability to sue a firearms manufacturer for the very kind of problems they're experiencing with their P320. So in order to protect jobs in their state, apparently the New Hampshire legislature is going along with SIG and trying to stop lawsuits over this pistol. These are the kind of people in charge of SIG. So what's going on here? Bottom line, cheaply made parts that do not necessarily meet specifications, dead triggers, ledges on safeties, poor quality control, no test firing apparently. So they are using the lie, deny, and threaten type of customer support. The exact opposite of what the American gun industry is known for. I don't know how to say this any other way. The future of SIG Sauer is in question. And it should be. How could SIG fix the 320 series and save their company? This is just my opinion. Now, if they actually do this, I will expect a consulting fee, which I don't really expect to receive. I think the only way they could save the 320, and possibly the only way they could save their company, is to completely redesign the P320 fire control unit. Change it from a fully cocked striker system, change the safety, upgrade the quality of their MIM parts, vastly upgrade the quality of their quality control system, and replace every fire control unit in every 320, M17, and M18 out there. And they would have to do it in a very short period of time, because many law enforcement agencies are at the point where if they can't use the SIG 320s, what are they going to carry? Do they have to go out and buy new things on an emergency basis to replace them? Do they have old weapons that they can put back into holsters to keep cops and military folks out on the street? Very questionable. This is a problem that I don't think can be fixed quickly, and it certainly can't be fixed cheaply. Cheaply is what got SIG where it is. That's my opinion. If I hear from SIG, I will probably hear from their lawyers. Folks, if you think this video was worthwhile, if you like my other videos, I ask you to subscribe. Resubscribe as necessary. Give me a thumbs up, give me a like. Leave a comment. This is one of the biggest catastrophes in the American gun industry that I've ever seen. The problem is massive. SIG's response is worse. They have caused their own problem, and they have no one to blame but themselves. Thank you for watching this video. Y'all be safe out there. Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.